What were the forces pitted against those seeking a total transformation of the conditions of industrial life? First, of course, there was the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie had everything to lose in such a total social upheaval. Confronted with workers' management, it stood to lose not only its ownership of the means of production, but also the possibility of privileged positions vested in the enterprise and in the exercise of decisional authority. No wonder the bourgeois breathed a sigh of relief when they saw that the leaders of the revolution would, quote, go no further than nationalization, end quote, and were keen to leave intact the order-giver, order-taker relationship in industry and elsewhere. True, large sections of the bourgeoisie fought desperately to regain their lost property. The Civil War was a protracted and bloody affair, but thousands of those who, through custom and culture, were more or less closely attached to the expropriated bourgeoisie were very soon offered the opportunity to re-enter the, quote, revolutionary stronghold, end quote, by the back door, as it were, and to resume their role as managers of the labor process in the, quote, workers' state, end quote. They seized this unexpected opportunity eagerly. In droves, they either joined the party or decided to cooperate with the party, cynically welcoming every utterance of Lenin or Trotsky in favor of, quote, labor discipline, end quote, or, quote, one-man management, end quote. Many were soon to be appointed from above to leading positions in the economy, merging with the new political administrative, quote, elite, end quote, of which the party itself formed the nucleus. The more, quote, enlightened, end quote, and technologically skilled sections of the, quote, expropriated class, end quote, soon resumed dominant positions in the relations of production. Secondly, the factory committee movement had to cope with openly hostile tendencies on the left, such as the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks repeatedly stressed that as the revolution could only be of bourgeois democratic type, there could be no future in attempts by the workers to manage production. All such endeavors were denounced as, quote, anarchist and, quote, utopian. In places, the Mensheviks proved a serious obstacle to the factory committee movement, but the opposition was anticipated, principled, and consistent. Thirdly, and far more difficult to see through, was the attitude of the Bolsheviks. Between March and October, the Bolsheviks supported the growth of the factory committees, only to turn viciously against them in the last few weeks of 1917, seeking to incorporate the factory committees into the new union structure to better emasculate them. This process, which is fully described in the pamphlet, was to play an important role in preventing the rapidly growing challenge to capitalist relations of production from coming to a head. Instead, the Bolsheviks canalized the energies released between March and October into a successful onslaught against the political power of the bourgeoisie and against the property relations on which that power was based. At this level, the revolution was, quote, successful, end quote. But the Bolsheviks were also, quote, successful, end quote, in restoring, quote, law and order, end quote, in industry, a law and order that reconsolidated the authoritarian relations in production, which for a brief period had been seriously shaken. Why did the party act in this manner? To answer the question would require a much fuller analysis of the Bolshevik Party and of its relation to the Russian working class than we can here attempt. Again, one would have to steer clear both of mythology, the, quote, great Bolshevik Party, end quote, quote, the weapon forged by Lenin, end quote, quote, the spearhead of the revolution, end quote, etc., and of anti-mythology, quote, the party as the embodiment of totalitarianism, militarism, and bureaucracy, etc., end quote. Seeking constantly to understand rather than to rant or rave, at the superficial level, both the party's ideology and its practice were firmly rooted in the specific historical circumstances of Tsarist Russia in the first decade of this century. Illegality and persecution partly explain, although they do not justify, the party's organizational structure and its conception of its relationship to the class. Footnote. Both explicitly outlined in the theory, Lenin, what is to be done, and one step forward, two steps back, and in the practice of Bolshevism between 1901 and 1917. End of footnote. What is more difficult to understand is the naivety of the Bolshevik leaders who don't seem to have appropriated the effects that this type of organization and this type of relationship to the class would inevitably have on the subsequent history of the party. Writing of the early history of the party, no lesser an exponent of Bolshevik orthodoxy than Trotsky was to state, quote, "The habits peculiar to a political machine were already forming in the underground. The young revolutionary bureaucrat was already emerging as a type. The conditions of conspiracy, true enough, offered rather meager scope for such formalities of democracy as elections, accountability, and control. Yet undoubtedly the committeemen narrowed these limitations considerably more than necessity demanded. They were far more intransigent and severe with the revolutionary working men that with themselves. They were far more intransigent and severe with the revolutionary working men that with themselves, preferring to domineer even on occasions that called imperatively for lending an attentive ear to the voice of the masses." Krupskaya notes that just as in the Bolshevik committees, so at the Congress itself, there were almost no working men. The intellectuals predominated. Quote, "The committee man," end quote, write Krupskaya, quote, "was usually quite a self-confident person. As a rule, he did not recognize any internal party democracy, did not want any innovations, did not desire and did not know how to adapt himself to rapidly changing conditions," end quote. That's from Trotsky's Stalin biography. What all this was to lead to was first hinted at in 1905. Soviets had appeared in many places. Quote, "The Petersburg Committee of the Bolsheviks was frightened at first by such an innovation as a non-partisan representation of the embattled masses. It could find nothing better to do than to present the Soviet with an ultimatum: immediately adopt a social democratic program or disband. The Petersburg Soviet as a whole, including the contingent of Bolshevik working men as well, ignored this ultimatum without batting an eyelid," end quote. Also from the Stalin biography. Pierre Bru, or Bruet, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I don't know, with when there's an apostrophe over the E in a French name. I'm gonna say it's Bruet. One of the most sophisticated apologists of Bolshevism was to write that, quote, "Those in the Bolshevik party who were the most favorable to the Soviets only saw in them, in the best of cases, auxiliaries for the party. Only belatedly did the party discover the role it could play in the Soviets and the interest that the Soviets presented for increasing the party's influence with a view to leading the masses," end quote. The problem is put here in a nutshell. The Bolshevik cadres saw their role as the leadership of the revolution. Any movement not initiated by them or independent of their control could only evoke their suspicion. It has often been said that the Bolsheviks were, quote, "surprised," end quote, by the creation of the Soviets. This euphemism should not mislead us. The reaction of the Bolsheviks was of far deeper significance than mere, quote, "surprise," end quote. It reflected a whole concept of revolutionary struggle, a whole concept of the relationship between workers and revolutionaries. The action of the Russian masses themselves, as far back as 1905, was already to condemn these attitudes as outdated. I missed a footnote here, but I'm going to read it. The same attitude was to be found within the party itself, as Trotsky himself was to say, this time approvingly, quote, "The statutes should express the leadership's organized distrust of the members, a distrust manifesting itself in vigilant control from above over the party," end quote. That quote's from Isaac Deutscher's Prophet Armed, published in 1954. Okay. End of footnote. This separation between the Bolsheviks and the masses was to be revealed repeatedly during 1917. It was first witnessed during the February Revolution, again at the time of the April Theses, and later still at the time of the July Days. Footnote. No, we are not saying that the military overthrow of the provisional government was possible in July. We are merely stressing how out of touch the party was with how out of touch the party was with what the masses really wanted. End of footnote. It has repeatedly been admitted that the party made, quote, mistakes, end quote, both in 1905 and in 1917, but this, quote, explanation, end quote, explains nothing. What one should be asking is what made these mistakes possible, and one can answer only if one understands the type of work undertaken by the party cadres from the creation of the party right up to the time of the revolution. The party leaders, from those on the Central Committee down to those in the charge of local groups, had been placed, through the combined effects of the conditions of the struggle against Tsarism and of their own organizational conceptions, in a situation which allowed them only tenuous links with the real workers' movement. Quote, a worker agitator, end quote, wrote Lenin, quote, who shows any talent and is at all promising should not work in the factory. We must see to it that he lives on party support and goes over to an underground status, end quote. Lenin. Footnote. No footnote. No wonder the few Bolshevik cadres of working class origin soon lost real contacts with the class. The Bolshevik Party was torn by contradiction, which helps explain its attitude before and after 1917. Its strength lay in the advanced workers who supported it. There is no doubt that this support was at times widespread and genuine, but these workers could not control the party. The leadership was firmly in the hands of professional revolutionaries. In a sense, this was inevitable. A clandestine press and the dissemination of propaganda could only be kept going regularly by militants constantly on the move and at times compelled to seek refuge overseas. A worker could only become a Bolshevik cadre on condition he ceased work and placed himself at the disposal of the party, which would then send him on special missions to this or that town. The apparatus of the party was in the hands of revolutionary specialists. The contradiction was that the real living forces that provided the strength of the party could not control it. As an institution, the party totally eluded control by the Russian working class. The problems encountered by the Russian Revolution after 1917 did not bring about the contradiction, they only served to exacerbate it. The attitude of the party in 1917 and after are products of its history. This is what rendered so futile most of the attempts made within the party by various oppositions between 1918 and 1921. They failed to perceive that a given ideological premise, the preordained hegemony of the party, led necessarily to certain conclusions in practice. But even this is probably not taking the analysis far enough. At even deeper level, the very conception of this kind of organization and this kind of relationship to the mass movement reflect the unrecognized influence of bourgeois ideology, even on the minds of those who were relentlessly seeking to overthrow bourgeois society. The concept that society must necessarily be divided into leaders and led, the notion that there are some born to rule while others cannot really develop beyond a certain stage, have from time immemorial been the tacit assumptions of every ruling class in history. For even the Bolsheviks, to accept them shows how correct Marx was when he proclaimed that, quote, the ruling ideas of each epoch are the ideas of its ruling class, end quote. Confronted with a, quote, efficient, end quote, tightly knit organization of this kind built on ideas of this kind, it is scarcely surprising that the emerging factory committees were unable to carry the revolution to completion. The final difficulty confronting the committees was inherent in the committee movement itself. Although certain individuals showed extraordinary lucidity, and although the committee movement represents the highest manifestation of the class struggle achieved in 1917, the movement as a whole was unable to understand what was happening in it and to offer any serious resistance. It did not succeed in generalizing its experiences, and the record it left is, unfortunately, very fragmentary. Unable to proclaim its own objectives, worker self-management, in clear and positive terms, it was inevitable that others would step into the vacuum. With the bourgeoisie in full disintegration and the working class as yet insufficiently strong or conscious to impose its own solutions to the problems tearing society apart, the triumphs of Bolshevism and of the bureaucracy were both inevitable. An analysis of the Russian Revolution shows that in allowing a specific group, separate from the workers themselves, to take over the function of managing production, the working class loses all possibility of even controlling the means of producing wealth. The separation of productive labor from the means of production results in an exploiting society. Moreover, when institutions such as the Soviets could no longer be influenced by ordinary workers, the regime could no longer be called a Soviet regime. By no stretch of the imagination could it still be taken to reflect the interests of the working class. The basic question, who manages production after the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, should therefore now become the center of any serious discussion about socialism. Today, the old equation, liquidation of the bourgeoisie equals worker state, popularized by countless Leninists, Stalinists, and Trotskyists, is just not good enough. In 1917, the Russian workers created organs, factory committees, and Soviets that might have ensured the management of society by the workers themselves, but the Soviets passed into the hands of the Bolshevik functionaries. A state apparatus separate from the masses was rapidly reconstituted. The Russian workers did not succeed in creating new institutions through which they would have managed both industry and social life. This task was therefore taken over by someone else, by a group whose specific task it became. The bureaucracy organized the work process in a country of whose political institutions it was also master. All this necessitates a serious reevaluation of several basic concepts. Quote, workers' power, end quote, cannot be identified or equated with the power of the party, as it repeatedly was by the Bolsheviks. In the words of Rosa Luxemburg, workers' power must be implemented, quote, by the class, not by a minority, managing things in the name of the class. It must emanate from the active involvement of the masses, remain under their direct influence, be submitted to control by the entire population, result from the increasing political awareness of the people, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. As for the concept of, quote, taking power, end quote, it cannot mean a semi-military putsch carried out by a minority, as it obviously does so for many who still seem to be living in the Petrograd of 1917, nor can it only mean the defense, however necessary, of what the working class has won against attempts by the bourgeoisie to win it back. What, quote, taking power, end quote, really implies is that the vast majority of the working class at last realizes its ability to manage both production and society and organize to this end. This text is in no sense an economic history of Russia between 1917 and 1921. It is, at best, a selective industrial chronology. In most instances, the facts speak for themselves. In a few places, we have taken the opportunity of describing our own views, particularly when we felt that all the protagonists in the great historical debates were wrong or trapped in a system of ideas that prevented them appreciating the real significance of what was happening. Events such as the stages of the Civil War are only mentioned in order to place various controversies in context and to nail once and for all the allegation that many of the measures described were taken, quote, as a result of the Civil War, end quote. It will probably be objected that throughout the narrative greater stress has been placed on various struggles within the party than on the actions of the millions who, for one reason or another, never joined the party or who, from the beginning, saw through what it was endeavoring to do. The quote charge, end quote, is true, but the shortcoming almost unavoidable. The aspirations of thousands of people, their doubts, their hesitations, their hopes, their sacrifices, their desire to transform the conditions of their daily life and their struggles to do so are undoubtedly as much a molding force of history as the resolutions of party congresses or the speeches of party leaders. Yet an activity that has neither rules nor statutes, neither tribunes nor troubadours, belongs almost by definition to what history suppresses. An awareness of the problem, however acute, will not generate the missing material. And an essay such as this is largely a question of documentation. The masses make history, they do not write history. And those who do write history are nearly always more concerned with ancestor worship and retrospective justification than with a balanced presentation of the facts. Other charges will also be made. The quotations from Lenin and Trotsky will not be denied, but it will be stated that they are, quote, selective, end quote, and that, quote, other things too, end quote, were said. Again, we plead, quote, guilty, end quote. But we would stress that there are hagiographers enough in the trade whose, quote, objectivity, end quote, like Deutscher's, for instance, is but a cloak for sophisticated apologetics. There is, moreover, another reason for unearthing this material. 50 years after the revolution and long after its, quote, isolation, end quote, has been broken, the bureaucratic system in Russia clearly bears little resemblance to the model of the Paris Commune, elected and revocable delegates, none receiving more than a workingman's wages, etc., etc. In fact, Russia's social structure has scarcely any anticipation in the whole corpus of Marxist theory. It therefore seems more relevant to quote those statements of the Bolshevik leaders of 1917 which helped determine Russia's evolution, rather than those other statements which, like the May Day speeches of labor leaders, were forever to remain in the realm of rhetoric. Notes on dates. On February 14, 1918, Russia abandoned the old Julian calendar and adopted the Gregorian one in use in Western Europe. February 1st became February 14th. Old-style dates have been observed up to this point. New-style dates thereafter.